Flight 782 taxied down the runway at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, its engines humming steadily as the first morning light spilled over the tarmac. It was an ordinary flight, the kind people rarely remembered beyond the ticket stub or the view from a window seat. Passengers shuffled down the aisles, dragging wheeled luggage and folding themselves into cramped seats. A young couple whispered quietly about their honeymoon plans, while a businessman in a navy suit tapped on his laptop, oblivious to the world around him. Somewhere near the back, a mother attempted to calm her wailing toddler, softly rocking the child against her shoulder. 10-year-old Mia sat by the window, her legs swinging slightly above the floor. Her sketchbook lay open on her lap, half filled with clouds and airplanes she'd drawn in countless flights before this one. Today, though, she didn't pick up her pencil. Instead, she pressed her nose to the glass, watching the clouds drift like a slow, endless river. The sunlight glinted off the airplane's wings, bouncing into her wide brown eyes. She liked flying, not just the thrill of takeoff, but the quiet hum of engines that made the world shrink below her. The flight attendants, clad in crisp uniforms, moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency. Each smile and nod was part of a rhythm they had perfected over hundreds of flights. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 782, non-stop to Chicago. Please make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened, your tray tables stowed, and your seat backs upright. We will be departing shortly." Their voices were calm, reassuring, almost hypnotic, lulling passengers into the illusion that nothing could ever go wrong. Behind the scenes in the cockpit, the morning routine was meticulous. Captain David Reynolds, 45, a veteran with over 20 years of flying experience, ran through his pre-flight checks, tapping switches and monitoring instruments. Beside him, First Officer Sam Patel, 32, focused intently on the flight plan, tracing lines of numbers and coordinates across his tablet. To them, this was just another flight, another day, another city to reach. Routine was their armor, and they relied on it heavily. At precisely 8:03 a.m., the plane lifted off, leaving the familiar gray of the city behind. A collective cheer of relief and excitement rose from some passengers, while others closed their eyes, drifting off into their own thoughts. Mia's mother leaned back, adjusting her scarf, glancing at her daughter with a gentle smile. "Enjoy the clouds," she said softly. Mia nodded but said nothing, already lost in the shifting skis outside. For the first 15 minutes, nothing unusual happened. The seatbelt signs clicked off, and passengers began settling into their routines. Some opened laptops, others read books or scrolled through phones. Coffee cups steamed in the trays, and the soft hum of conversation blended with the constant drone of engines. A sense of mundane normalcy wrapped the cabin like a comfortable blanket. Then at 8:21 a.m. it happened. A low, unfamiliar vibration hummed through the fuselage. It wasn't violent at first, but it was persistent, a subtle disruption that made a few heads turn. The plane shuddered lightly, enough to rattle a cup of coffee in a businessman's hand. Passengers glanced around, curious but not alarmed. But the cockpit reacted differently. The intercom crackled faintly as Captain Reynolds responded to air traffic control, then silence. The silence grew. First Officer Patel's voice didn't follow. The intercom remained dead. The plane hummed along at 35,000 feet, obedient to its autopilot, yet unmoored from human guidance. Flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, their practiced smiles faltering. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers picked up on the tension, their ears straining for reassurance, for any sign that someone was in control. A young mother gripped her child, whispering frantic prayers, while an elderly man clutched the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mia felt it immediately. Her stomach tightened and her small hands gripped the armrest. She looked toward the cockpit, an invisible barrier of steel and mystery separating the pilots from the world she occupied. Something had gone wrong. She didn't understand the mechanics, but instinct told her that the familiar routine had shattered. Her pencil trembled in her hand as she stared at the cockpit door, as if willing someone to respond. Passengers began to murmur louder now, some asking the flight attendants what was happening. "Everything is fine," one attendant repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. A ripple of fear coursed through the cabin. Phones lit up as frantic calls were made, hands shaking while messages typed out half-formed sentences of worry. "Flight 782, something's wrong, help please." The reality was inescapable. This was no ordinary turbulence. This was something entirely different, something that made every person aboard suddenly aware of how fragile their lives could be. And then the plane lurched again, more sharply this time, like a living creature testing the patience of its passengers. Mia gripped the seat in front of her, heart hammering in her chest. Across the aisle, a businessman's tie flapped as he tried to steady himself. The couple whispered frantically to each other, fear creeping into their honeymoon bliss. The toddler's wails crescendoed into an ear-piercing scream that cut through the cabin, adding to the tension that was already palpable. Flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, trying to calm passengers, trying to keep order in a moment that was rapidly unraveling. Their hands shook slightly, but their voices remained calm, professional. Yet even they glanced nervously toward the cockpit, where the heart of the problem lay. The pilot's silence was complete. Every routine check, every practice maneuver, every protocol seemed to vanish in that moment. The plane was airborne, moving forward, but untethered from the guidance of those who should have been at the helm. Mia's mother tried to soothe her daughter. "It's okay, honey. Everything's okay," she whispered, but her own voice quavered. Fear was contagious, spreading like a cold wind through the cabin. Yet Mia did not look at her mother. Her eyes were locked on the cockpit door. Something inside her stirred, a mix of curiosity, intuition, and an unspoken understanding that she had to do something. Even at 10 years old, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. And for the first time, the world outside the window seemed distant and irrelevant. The plane continued on its course, a metallic bird in the endless sky, engines humming, passengers frozen between disbelief and panic. No one spoke for long moments, the silence punctuated only by the occasional click of a seatbelt, the rustle of paper, or the soft whimpers of frightened children. And then, deep inside her, Mia made a decision. The simulation games her father had taught her, the hours spent memorizing controls and emergency protocols, all of it suddenly mattered. It was no longer a game, it was real. The moment stretched, the sky outside untouched by the chaos within. Flight 782, ordinary only minutes ago, was now suspended in a fragile state between life and catastrophe. And at the center of it all, a small girl pressed her tiny hands together, inhaling sharply, eyes fixed on the cockpit door. The world was holding its breath, waiting. Suspense hook. The pilots were silent. The plane was moving forward untethered. And Mia, 10 years old, was the only one stepping into the unknown. The plane shuddered again, sharper this time, as if it had become aware of the growing panic inside the cabin. Flight attendants rushed from row to row, trying to calm passengers whose nerves were fraying like loose wires. "Please remain seated. Please keep your seatbelt fastened," one shouted, her voice trembling despite her professional tone. Her words barely registered as adults clutched children, faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. A man muttered curses under his breath, his knuckles white against the armrest. Phones glowed like tiny emergency lanterns, screens filled with frantic messages and calls, some unanswered, others dropped mid-dial. Mia, still seated near the window, watched the chaos with a strange mixture of fear and clarity. While the adults panicked, her mind worked quickly, cataloging everything she had learned about planes, controls, and emergency procedures. She had memorized the cockpit layout from her father's flight simulator hours, pretending it was a game, never imagining she would need it for real. Yet now, that knowledge bubbled to the surface with frightening relevance. She could feel it in her fingertips, like a pulse guiding her, telling her she had to act. Across the aisle, a mother clutched her sleeping child, whispering frantic prayers. "It's okay, sweetie. It's okay," she murmured, but her voice betrayed the terror she felt. Behind her, a businessman scrambled to gather loose papers that had fallen to the floor during the lurch. Each movement seemed amplified by the strange quiet that had settled in the cockpit, the absence of pilots' voices leaving a void filled with fear. The autopilot hummed mechanically, carrying the plane forward, but no one at the controls meant no one could anticipate what might come next. Flight attendants tried to organize the cabin, their experience evident but their confidence faltering. "Stay calm. We're trained for emergencies," one called, but her words rang hollow. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, some pressing foreheads to windows, others whispering frantic goodbyes into cell phones that no longer connected. Even the hum of the engines, normally a comforting constant, felt ominous now, like the drone of a creature breathing over a sleeping city. Every bump of turbulence sent a collective shiver through the cabin. Mia's mother reached for her daughter, gently trying to hold her close. "Honey, don't move. Just stay with me," she said, but Mia didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the cockpit door, her small hands tightening around the armrests. Something inside her told her she couldn't just stay put. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but instinct whispered that the adults might not be able to save them. A strange calm settled over her as fear coursed through everyone else. The plane lurched violently, tipping slightly to the left. A collective gasp echoed through the cabin as overhead compartments rattled. Bags shifted on their racks, and a water bottle tumbled down the aisle. The flight attendants moved with agility, catching items before they could fall, but the intensity of the moment was overwhelming. The passengers' fear was contagious, each shiver, each cry magnified by the others around them. Then came the intercom, clicks, static, and finally silence. The cockpit remained closed, no voice to reassure, no guidance to calm the storm inside the cabin. A veteran flight attendant approached the cockpit door, hand hovering over the emergency access panel. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She knocked gently. "Captain, first officer, can you hear me?" Nothing. Her eyes flicked toward the passengers, who were now standing, panicked, pressing forward, desperate for answers. Passengers began to murmur, louder this time, questions mingling with hysteria. "Why isn't anyone answering?" a man shouted. "What's happening?" A woman's voice cracked as she pleaded, "Please tell me we'll be okay." Flight attendants tried to calm them, but every explanation felt insufficient, every promise hollow. Outside, the clouds seemed peaceful, the sky indifferent to the chaos unfolding within the metal tube soaring through it. Mia felt herself moving, almost without thinking. She slipped from her seat, backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, her small legs carrying her toward the cockpit door. Flight attendants froze, their faces pale, some instinctively stepping in her path. "No, you can't," one began, but Mia's eyes didn't leave the heavy door. Her gaze was unflinching, a combination of determination and instinct that even the adults couldn't comprehend. "Wait," her mother cried, rising from her seat, panic breaking through her own shock. She chased after Mia, reaching out, but the little girl didn't falter. She had crossed the aisle, weaving between seated passengers who instinctively made way, as if understanding that something extraordinary was happening. Every heartbeat thundered in her chest as she approached the cockpit door, the hum of engines and the low creak of the fuselage blending into a tense symphony of fear. A few passengers whispered, watching in awe as this tiny figure approached the control room that had become a symbol of terror. "Is she going to?" one muttered, disbelief coloring every word. Flight attendants exchanged glances, weighing whether to stop her or trust what instinct seemed to demand. For the first time, it seemed that courage could manifest in the smallest of forms, and in that realization, the cabin held its collective breath. Mia reached the cockpit door, pressing both hands against it. The weight was surprising, the metal cool against her palms. Her small fingers fumbled over the emergency access panel, trying combinations she had memorized in countless games, in simulations that had never truly mattered until now. Her pulse raced, but her focus was absolute. She pressed a button, then another, her voice barely above a whisper as she called out, "Hello, can anyone hear me?" There was no immediate response, only the steady, unrelenting hum of the engines. The plane had leveled out slightly, but turbulence jostled it, reminding everyone aboard of the precariousness of their situation. Behind her, the cabin watched, silent now, entranced by the bravery of a child who dared to confront a crisis adults couldn't manage. Hearts pounded in sync, passengers whispering desperate prayers, clinging to hope that somehow, something could be done. Flight attendants stood back, some holding onto the aisle seats, bracing themselves, unsure whether to intervene. Each passing second stretched unbearably, the silence from the cockpit deafening. Mia pressed a second button, then a third, trying to engage the intercom, her small voice growing steadier despite the chaos around her. Flight 782, please respond. Is anyone there? The plane lurched violently, sending a ripple of panic through the cabin. Coffee cups spilled, papers flew, and a child cried out. Mia's knees buckled slightly under the weight of the moment, but she stayed pressed to the door, her determination unbroken. Somewhere above the clouds, at 35,000 feet, the ordinary morning had vanished. Flight 782 was no longer a routine journey. It was a battlefield of fear, courage, and uncertainty. And in that moment, a 10-year-old girl had become the center of it all. Suspense hook. The cockpit remained silent. The plane drifted, untethered, and every person aboard knew that if someone didn't act immediately, Flight 782 could spiral into catastrophe. And only Mia, small but determined, had the chance to take control. Mia's small hands trembled as she pressed against the cockpit door, the emergency panel beneath her fingertips seeming impossibly complex. Rows of switches, buttons, and blinking lights formed a pattern she recognized from hours of flight simulator games with her father. But this was no longer a game. This was real. Real engines, real passengers, real stakes. Her mind raced, cataloging every detail she had memorized, every lever she had practiced moving, every sequence that could save lives. Behind her, the cabin was a mixture of chaos and frozen disbelief. Adults clutched children to their chests, whispered prayers under trembling breaths, and stared at the small girl who had dared to step into the cockpit alone. Flight attendants hovered nearby, their faces pale but awed, unsure whether to stop her or let courage guide her. One whispered under her breath, she's going to try." Mia took a deep breath, her gaze flicking to the blinking lights on the panel. She remembered the sequence: autopilot override, communication channel, throttle control, landing gear sequence. Words her father had drilled into her echoed in her mind. Her small fingers found the first switch, flipping it with precision. The intercom crackled faintly, static first, then a distant voice. "Flight 782, come in, do you copy?" The voice of air traffic control was tense, clipped but steady. Mia's eyes widened, they had heard her. Relief surged, and with it a renewed focus. "This is Flight 782, she squeaked, voice high but surprisingly calm. I'm here. The pilots, they can't, I'm taking control." The voice on the other end paused, a mixture of disbelief and horror. Who is this?" "Flight 782, identify yourself." I'm a passenger. I know how to fly the plane," Mia said, gripping the console with both hands. Her voice wavered slightly, but her determination carried through. "Please help me. I need instructions." The cabin behind her held its collective breath. Passengers whispered prayers, held hands, and stared in awe at the 10-year-old who had become the only person capable of guiding them through the unfolding nightmare. Flight attendants leaned against nearby seats, offering quiet words of encouragement and bracing themselves for every possible outcome. Air traffic control's voice returned, sharper now. "Do you have experience in aviation? Are you trained?" I've practiced, a lot. Simulators," Mia admitted, glancing down at the control panel. She could feel her pulse hammering in her temples, but every instinct she had absorbed over years of practice surged forward, giving her courage. "I think I can manage the autopilot and landing approach, but I need guidance." The radio crackled again. Okay, we'll guide you. Listen carefully. First, engage the autopilot. Then set your heading to 270 and maintain altitude until we walk you through a descent procedure." Mia nodded, even though they couldn't see her. Her fingers moved with precision, flipping switches and setting the autopilot. The plane steadied slightly, humming along like a giant metallic bird that had been waiting for someone to guide it. Behind her, a flight attendant's hand rested on the back of a seat, trembling as she whispered, "Go on, Mia. You can do it." The turbulence outside seemed to intensify, as if the sky itself tested her resolve. Mia glanced at the windows, seeing nothing but clouds stretching endlessly in all directions. She swallowed, trying to steady her racing heart. Every passenger in the cabin was now utterly dependent on her, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down like gravity stronger than the atmosphere outside. The plane lurched again, this time more violently. A coffee cup toppled over in a passenger's lap, spilling scalding liquid onto the floor. A woman screamed, clutching her arm, while a toddler cried hysterically. Flight attendants moved to help, shouting reassurances. Mia, however, could not allow herself to be distracted. Every motion had to be precise. Every command mattered. "Throttle control," she whispered to herself, remembering the simulations. She adjusted the levers carefully, feeling the vibration of the engines through her fingertips. The plane responded, stabilizing slightly as she exhaled. The lights on the control panel blinked with urgency, warning of minor inconsistencies, but nothing catastrophic. Not yet. Behind her, a man muttered to no one in particular, "That child, she's actually doing it." Others nodded, awestruck and terrified, watching as a tiny figure commanded the fate of over 100 lives with nothing but determination and memory. The cockpit, once silent, had become a stage where bravery transcended age, experience, and fear. Mia's small hands moved from the autopilot controls to the communication panel, repeating the instructions from air traffic control. "Set heading 270. Maintain altitude until further instructions." She adjusted the plane, feeling it respond beneath her, the hum of engines steadying into a rhythm she could understand. Her pulse was rapid, but her mind was sharper than ever. Air traffic control's voice returned, urgent but careful. "You're doing fine. Now we need to prepare for descent. Flaps and landing gear controls are next. Follow my instructions carefully. Can you do that?" "I'll try," Mia said, gripping the edge of the console. Her hands shook, but she followed the voice's guidance, flipping switches and adjusting levers with meticulous care. The plane began to tilt downward slightly, responding to her every input. Behind her, passengers clutched each other, some whispering prayers, some holding tears back, all silently acknowledging the impossible feat unfolding before them. Suddenly, a violent jolt threw her forward slightly. The turbulence outside hit hard, rattling the fuselage and shaking the plane as if it had a mind of its own. Mia bit her lip, refusing to cry out. She remembered what her father had always said, "Stay calm, one step at a time." Her fingers moved over the panel, steadying the plane, adjusting throttle and pitch. Slowly, carefully, Flight 782 began to respond. The cabin remained tense, the air thick with fear and awe. Flight attendants whispered encouragement, holding onto rails, bracing themselves, guiding frightened passengers. Every eye was on Mia, the girl who had suddenly become a pilot in a life-or-death scenario. Her small stature belied the enormity of the task before her. Then came a moment of stillness. The plane leveled out slightly, a collective exhale passing through the cabin. For a heartbeat, the impossible seemed within reach. Mia's gaze flicked to the control panel, scanning lights and readouts, each a vital thread in the intricate web of aviation she had learned in simulations. She was doing it. She was actually flying the plane. But outside, the sky remained turbulent, the threat far from over. The plane had survived the first tests, but the descent, the approach, and the landing loomed ahead, a complex dance of physics and precision that could not be improvised. The stakes could not have been higher. Every second, every decision mattered. Suspense hook. Mia had taken control, a child in a cockpit with lives in her hands, but the real test, the descent and landing, was just beginning. Would she make it through the next phase, or would Flight 782 fall from the sky before anyone could stop it? Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself against the cockpit door, the heavy metal cool beneath her small palms. Every muscle in her body trembled, but she forced herself to stay steady. Behind her, the cabin watched in a tense, breathless silence, every passenger aware that the fate of Flight 782 now rested on this 10-year-old girl. Flight attendants stood just a few feet away, some with hands hovering near her shoulders, unsure whether to intervene. They could do nothing but trust the courage that emanated from her small frame. The emergency access panel glowed under her fingertips, a labyrinth of switches, buttons, and levers. Mia traced each line and icon, her mind recalling years of simulation practice. She had memorized the cockpit layout in detail, from the throttle levers to the autopilot interface, from the communication panel to the landing gear controls. Every flight simulator session with her father had prepared her, though she had never imagined it would matter in real life. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the first button, hearing a faint click and a soft whirring behind the door. A crackle of static came through the intercom. "Flight 782, can you hear me?" Air traffic control's voice sounded distant but urgent, clipped with the tension of professionals accustomed to emergencies but unprepared for this scenario. "I hear you," Mia squeaked, her voice small but surprisingly steady. I can't reach the pilots. I think they're gone. I need instructions." The voice hesitated. You're a passenger." "Yes, but I know the controls. I've practiced. I can do this. Please help me." Her words were quick, precise, almost rehearsed, but the emotion underneath trembled with the weight of reality. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that stretches time and makes a person feel every second of their heartbeat. "Okay. Listen carefully," the controller said finally. "We will guide you. Step 1, engage autopilot. Step 2, maintain your current altitude and heading. Step 3, prepare for descent when instructed." Mia's small fingers flew over the switches. Each click, each lever adjustment, each flick of a switch was deliberate. Her pulse raced, but her mind was laser-focused. Behind her, passengers and flight attendants alike leaned forward slightly, witnessing a miracle in motion. The autopilot engaged and the plane steadied, the engines humming with a steady, mechanical rhythm. The first hurdle was cleared, but the larger, more terrifying challenge awaited. The cabin was tense with anticipation. A few passengers whispered prayers under their breaths, others held tightly onto seatmates or children, eyes wide. The plane swayed gently in the turbulent air, a metallic giant suspended in clouds, guided by the hands of a child. Each shudder and rumble reminded everyone that survival was not guaranteed. Mia, however, barely noticed the panic around her. Her entire being was absorbed by the task at hand. Next came the communication checks. Mia picked up the radio panel, repeating the numbers and commands air traffic control gave her. Each transmission brought reassurance, not only to the controller but to the passengers and crew who had come to realize that she was their only hope. The intercom crackled, offering instructions on the approach and descent. Her voice, though small, conveyed authority, guiding both passengers and herself through the first steps of the impossible task. Suddenly, a violent lurch rocked the plane. Turbulence had intensified, shaking the fuselage and rattling overhead compartments. A coffee cup flew off a tray table, narrowly missing a passenger's lap. Flight attendants shouted, "Brace! Brace!" while holding onto whatever they could. Mia's stomach lurched, but her hands remained firm on the controls. She adjusted throttle and pitch instinctively, recalling the simulations that had drilled these emergency maneuvers into her memory. A man seated near the aisle muttered in disbelief, "She's actually doing it." His voice was shaky, filled with awe. Others nodded, clinging to reality as a fragile, miraculous thread. The passenger's fear was palpable, but it was tempered by an emerging, tentative hope. One small child whispered, "She's saving us," unaware that her words perfectly captured the miracle unfolding. Mia's mother finally caught up, her hands trembling as she reached out to guide her daughter. "Mia, honey, are you sure?" she began, but Mia's gaze met hers, and in that single look her mother saw both the fear and determination that refused to yield. "I can do this, Mom," Mia said, voice trembling but resolute. "Just tell me what to do." Her words, simple yet impossible, anchored the hope of everyone aboard. The next challenge loomed: descent. Air traffic control's voice guided her, each instruction precise. Lower the flaps to 15 degrees, reduce throttle gradually, adjust trim to maintain altitude, approach heading 265, confirm landing gear is down at 5,000 feet. Mia's fingers flew over the controls. She felt the plane respond beneath her hands, pitching slightly as flaps extended, adjusting throttle, correcting trim. A light on the panel blinked, gear not down. Panic flashed for a heartbeat, but she remembered the procedure, flipping the switch and watching the indicator turn green. The plane hummed steadily once again, obedient to her commands. Passengers remained tense but started to breathe a little easier, though their eyes never left the small figure controlling the massive aircraft. Flight attendants held each other's hands, bracing against turbulence, whispering quiet encouragement. The extraordinary had become reality. A 10-year-old guiding a commercial jet with hundreds of lives aboard through the sky, navigating procedures that had terrified even trained adults. A sudden alarm sounded, sharp and insistent. Smoke detectors in the cabin flickered, warning lights blinked on the control panel. Mia's stomach dropped. Something had gone wrong. Was it a system error, turbulence, engine trouble? She didn't have time to analyze fully. Air traffic control's voice cut through, calm but urgent. "We see minor anomalies, but keep going. Focus on approach. Don't panic." Mia exhaled, a shaky but steady breath. She adjusted the plane's pitch, checked instruments, and repeated the descent procedure. Step by step, she executed commands with precision, guided by voices she trusted, instinct she had developed, and sheer courage she had never imagined she possessed. The plane leveled slightly, responding to her adjustments, and the tension in the cabin began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. The sky outside was turbulent, clouds rolling in ominous waves, yet inside, a remarkable calm took hold. One by one, passengers glanced at one another, whispering, "She's doing it. She's really doing it." Flight attendants gave small nods, eyes glistening with relief and awe. Mia's determination had become a beacon, illuminating the possibility of survival against staggering odds. And yet, despite the temporary calm, danger still loomed. The descent was far from complete. The approach, the landing, the alignment with the runway, all remained obstacles that demanded precision beyond a child's natural abilities. The plane responded now, yes, but any miscalculation could spell disaster. Every passenger, every crew member, and every soul on that flight was teetering on the knife's edge between life and catastrophe. Suspense hook. Mia had entered the cockpit, pressed buttons, and engaged controls no child should ever need to touch. But the true challenge awaited, aligning Flight 782 for landing, against turbulence, altitude shifts, and human error. Could a 10-year-old guide a plane to the Earth safely, or would the sky claim them all? Mia's small fingers gripped the throttle levers as the hum of the engines vibrated through the cockpit. Every gauge, every blinking light, every dial demanded her full attention. The autopilot had stabilized the plane, but she knew the real test was just beginning. The descent and approach to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Air traffic control's voice was calm but tense, walking her through each step with patience that bordered on disbelief. Keep altitude steady at 35,000 feet. Heading remains 265. Prepare for descent instructions at 10,000 feet. The plane lurched as turbulence hit. Clouds streaked past the windows like rushing rivers of gray, and passengers clutched the armrests, white-knuckled, as the aircraft pitched slightly to the left. The cabin was tense, every whisper, sob, and prayer amplified by the metal walls. Flight attendants moved quickly, reassuring passengers while bracing themselves. Behind them, a toddler clutched a stuffed bear, frightened yet trusting that anyone was in control. Mia swallowed hard and adjusted the throttle, recalling what she had learned in simulations. She spoke into the intercom, her voice trembling but controlled. "Flight 782, adjusting altitude now. Please remain calm." A few passengers turned toward her, bewildered that a child had become the voice of reason in a sky spiraling toward chaos. Air traffic control responded promptly. Good. Now start gradual descent to 10,000 feet. Flaps to 10 degrees, adjust trim to maintain stability. Confirm speed at 300 knots. I'm adjusting, Mia replied, eyes scanning the dials. She moved her small hands across the panel, flipping switches and pushing levers with precision. The plane tilted slightly, engines whining as they throttled down. Her pulse raced, but her mind was steady. Every adjustment, every click had a purpose. The descent brought turbulence in spades. The plane shuddered violently as pockets of storm twisted the fuselage. Coffee spilled, a passenger's phone clattered to the floor, and a woman gasped sharply, clutching the seat in front of her. Flight attendants shouted over the roar, "Brace! Brace!" Their voices were calm but tense, grounding the panic-stricken passengers with disciplined authority. Mia's fingers tightened on the controls. "Flaps 10 degrees," she whispered to herself, as if repeating a mantra. "Trim, adjust, throttle steady." The plane responded, slowly but steadily, obeying her commands. Every passenger felt the shift, subtle but vital, as Flight 782 stabilized despite the raging turbulence outside. And then came the warning lights. Red and yellow icons blinked on the dashboard, engine anomalies. Smoke detectors in the cabin flickered faintly, though no visible smoke appeared. A low, urgent alarm beeped. Mia froze for a heartbeat, her stomach twisting. The simulations had never prepared her for this. Panic threatened to overtake her. "Don't panic, Mia," she whispered, clutching the throttle. Air traffic control's voice cut through the tension. "Minor engine irregularities. Adjust throttle slightly. Do not make sudden movements. Maintain heading." "Yes, yes," she breathed, adjusting. The plane responded, tilting slightly but stabilizing. Relief surged briefly, but the alarms reminded everyone that the danger was far from over. Passengers gripped each other tightly, eyes wide, as the reality sank in. A 10-year-old was literally flying their plane through an emergency descent. "Maintain speed at 300 knots, air traffic control instructed. Prepare for landing gear extension at 5,000 feet. Flaps to 25 degrees for final approach." Mia nodded, even though they couldn't see her. Her hands moved over the controls, pressing levers and toggling switches. The plane tilted slightly downward, descending through clouds that seemed alive, buffeting the aircraft with invisible fists. Every passenger felt the invisible forces at play, the delicate balance between life and catastrophe. Behind her, a flight attendant whispered almost to herself, "She's doing it. She's actually doing it." Passengers nodded, clinging to the hope that the impossible might be possible. The cabin had become a fragile bubble of faith and fear, suspended between panic and miracle. Suddenly, a violent jolt rocked the plane. The left engine flared briefly, a low sputtering sound accompanying the warning lights. Coffee spilled, a suitcase rattled across the aisle, and a toddler cried out. "Keep calm," a flight attendant shouted, bracing herself. Mia's pulse thundered in her ears, but her mind narrowed to a singular focus. She remembered the training, the simulations, the countless hours at the controls. Step by step, she adjusted throttle and trim, compensating for the engine anomaly. Her fingers were steady now, guided by instinct and a courage far beyond her years. Air traffic control's voice cut in again. "Adjust descent angle slightly. You're doing fine. Focus on the approach. Gear down at 5,000 feet, flaps 25 degrees. Confirm speed." I'm adjusting," Mia replied, her small voice carrying authority. She glanced at the control panel, verifying each instrument. Everything had to be precise. One misstep, one wrong lever, and the plane could spin into chaos. The plane shuddered again, turbulence like invisible fists battering its wings. Outside, the clouds twisted and roared, indifferent to the lives suspended within their grasp. Passengers clutched each other, praying, gasping, holding their collective breath. And through it all, Mia remained focused, her small hands flying over the panel with astonishing precision. 5,000 feet, air traffic control warned. Gear down, flaps 25 steady. You've got this, Mia, keep calm. She pressed the gear lever, watching as lights on the panel switched from red to green. The flaps extended smoothly. The plane responded, tilting and descending gently, obeying her commands. A collective, cautious sigh echoed through the cabin, but the tension remained. The descent was far from over, and the sky above remained treacherous. Mia's heart raced, but determination overpowered fear. She spoke into the intercom, calming the passengers as best she could. "We're descending now. Everything is under control. Stay in your seats, please. We're going to be okay." Her words carried reassurance, a fragile shield against the panic surrounding her. The turbulence remained, but slowly, methodically, Flight 782 stabilized under her guidance. Her hands were steady, her mind focused, and her courage unwavering. Passengers whispered prayers, held hands, and watched in awe as a 10-year-old child executed emergency procedures that could have terrified even seasoned pilots. Suspense hook. The descent was underway and the landing gear was down. But the runway was still miles away, the winds were turbulent, and the true challenge, the final approach and landing, had yet to begin. Would Flight 782 make it safely to the ground, or would the sky prove too cruel even for a child's bravery? Mia's small hands clutched the control yoke as Flight 782 trembled through the turbulent sky. Clouds rolled past in waves, thick and gray, lit only by the muted morning sun struggling to pierce the storm. Her pulse thundered in her ears, each heartbeat echoing the stakes. Hundreds of lives hung in the balance, and every motion she made would either guide them safely or unleash catastrophe. Behind her, the cabin was tense, a fragile mix of panic and hope, passengers gripping seatbacks and praying, whispering, clutching each other as if physical contact could somehow shield them from fate. Air traffic control's voice crackled through the intercom, calm yet urgent. "Mia, you're doing great. Keep your descent angle steady. Adjust trim slightly to compensate for turbulence. The runway lights are visible. Prepare for landing sequence." Mia's gaze darted to the window. In the distance, the faint, blinking lights of the airport appeared through the thick clouds. She swallowed hard, hands tightening on the controls. Every simulation she had practiced came flooding back. Flare procedure, throttle adjustment, rudder control. None of it mattered unless she executed perfectly in this very second. The plane shuddered violently, pitching left and right, as gusts tore through the sky. A wave of panic rippled through the cabin. A mother clutched her child, murmuring frantic prayers. A businessman muttered under his breath, disbelief etched across his face. Flight attendants shouted instructions over the roar, holding onto rails, bracing themselves as the aircraft tilted dangerously. And through it all, Mia remained focused, her small frame unmoving except for the precise motions of her hands on the controls. "Throttle steady," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the turbulence. "Flaps 25 trim correct." The plane responded slowly, obediently, stabilizing against the violent gusts. Every adjustment was a calculated risk. Every fraction of a second mattered. Her pulse raced, yet her mind remained clear. The autopilot could no longer handle the subtle complexities of this final approach. It was all up to her. 500 feet above runway elevation, air traffic control warned. "Prepare for flare and touchdown. Keep wings level, steady speed. You've got this, Mia." Mia's breath caught. The flare, the critical moment where the plane would transition from descent to landing, approached. She adjusted the yoke carefully, lifting the nose slightly, feeling the aircraft respond. Sparks of fear and exhilaration raced through her small body. The engines roared as she balanced throttle and descent, every muscle tensed, every thought concentrated on the runway below. The turbulence intensified. Wind buffeted the wings, tossing the plane in violent waves. The hum of the engines was deafening. Overhead compartments rattled, coffee cups toppled, and a suitcase tumbled down the aisle. Passengers clung to seats and each other, whispering desperate prayers. The The collective anxiety in the cabin was almost tangible, and yet Mia's focus never wavered. Keep the wings level, adjust for crosswind. Air traffic control's voice cut through the roar, clipped and precise. Mia twisted the yoke slightly, compensating for the lateral gusts. The aircraft leaned, then corrected, responding to her precise inputs. Behind her, flight attendants whispered encouragement, bracing against the shifts, guiding passengers in tense silence. A toddler's soft whimpers echoed in the background, barely audible over the storm outside. At 200 feet, the runway lights glowed brighter, cutting through the gray haze. Mia adjusted the throttle again, smoothing the descent. "Flare, flare, flare," she whispered, raising the nose gently, letting the wheels approach the tarmac. The vibrations through the plane were intense, the landing gear ready to make contact with Earth after a harrowing journey in the clouds. Then a sudden lurch. A gust slammed the aircraft sideways, and for a heart-stopping moment it felt as though Flight 782 might tilt too far. Mia's fingers dug into the yoke, adjusting with precision she didn't know she possessed. Air traffic control's voice remained calm but urgent. "Correct, correct, steady, almost there." The plane touched down with a jolt, wheels screeching against the runway. Sparks flew as friction kissed the asphalt. Passengers cried out, some in terror, some in relief. The plane skidded slightly, but Mia corrected expertly, lowering the nose and adjusting throttle to maintain stability. Every second was critical. Every fraction of motion could tip the balance between survival and disaster. Behind her, the cabin erupted in cautious cheers. Adults clutched each other, tears streaming down faces, while children stared in awe at the small girl who had just taken control of a giant jetliner. Flight attendants whispered, "She's doing it. She's landing the plane." Some even wept quietly, overwhelmed by the miraculous convergence of courage, knowledge, and determination. The plane continued down the runway, gradually slowing. Brakes hissed as friction increased, tires squealing under immense pressure. Mia monitored the instruments, keeping the aircraft centered on the strip, compensating for minor deviations. Crosswinds gusted, threatening to veer the plane off course, but she adjusted minute by minute, inch by inch, mastering every challenge with steady hands and unyielding resolve. At last the aircraft slowed to a crawl, the runway lights stretching behind them like a glittering ribbon. The plane shuddered one final time, engines humming, brakes fully engaged, and then stillness. Flight 782 had touched down. A collective gasp swept through the cabin, followed by tentative applause. Some passengers wept openly, tears of relief mingling with disbelief. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, holding children, helping adults, reassuring everyone that the nightmare was over. Mia's mother enveloped her daughter in a trembling embrace, rocking her as if she could shield her from the aftershocks of adrenaline and fear. Mia's hands shook, her small frame trembling with exhaustion and relief. The plane was grounded, safe, and yet the full weight of what she had just accomplished began to sink in. A 10-year-old had just landed a commercial aircraft, navigating emergencies, turbulence, and a cockpit full of unresponsive pilots. The world outside remained oblivious to the miracle that had just occurred at 35,000 feet. Air traffic control's voice cut through one final time. "Flight 782, you made it. Incredible work. Incredible." Mia pressed her hands to her knees, letting herself exhale fully for the first time. The plane, now stationary, was silent except for the gentle hum of engines winding down. But even in that moment of victory, questions lingered. Why had both pilots gone silent? What had caused the cockpit to become unreachable in the first place? Passengers and crew stared at one another, sharing glances filled with awe and lingering fear. The danger had passed, yes, but the mystery behind the catastrophe remained unsolved. Suspense hook. Flight 782 had landed. Everyone was alive. But the pilots remained silent, and the cause of the in-flight crisis was unknown. The world had witnessed a miracle, but it also had a terrifying question hanging over it. Why had the flight been in peril in the first place? Flight 782 sat quietly on the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare, engines cooling and tires still warm from the intense landing. Outside, emergency vehicles gathered, their lights flashing in an urgent red and blue rhythm. Passengers remained buckled, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and lingering adrenaline freezing them in place. Many stared at one another, mouths open, unable to articulate the magnitude of what had just occurred. A 10-year-old child had landed a commercial airliner, and yet the world outside had not yet caught up with the miracle in motion. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, helping passengers to stand. Some cried quietly, others embraced family members, still trembling. "You did it, Mia," one whispered, voice breaking. The little girl's mother enveloped her in a trembling hug, rocking her gently, whispering, "You saved all of us. You saved us, honey." Tears ran down her cheeks, blending with sweat and the residue of pure, unfiltered terror. Mia, exhausted beyond belief, rested her forehead against her mother's shoulder. She felt relief, but it was tempered by the lingering question: why had the pilots gone silent? Finally, the cockpit door opened. Emergency personnel and airline officials approached cautiously, preparing for what they expected would be an extraordinary scene. Flight attendants gestured for passengers to remain seated until authorities had secured the aircraft. The plane that had been a vessel of fear, turbulence, and uncertainty now became a stage for revelation. Mia, small yet resolute, stepped forward with her mother guiding her. Airline staff and emergency responders watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief as the child approached the cockpit she had commanded mere moments ago. They could see her small hands still trembling slightly, her face pale but alive with determination. This was the girl who had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. Then came the pilots. Captain David Reynolds and First Officer Sam Patel were found slumped in their seats, unresponsive but breathing shallowly. Paramedics rushed forward, checking vitals and quickly attaching oxygen masks. A low murmur ran through the cabin as passengers realized the gravity of the situation. The pilots' silence had not been voluntary. It had been the result of a sudden, unexplained incapacitation. "What happened?" passengers whispered to one another. Flight attendants, now more composed but still shaken, explained what they could. "We don't know yet. They suddenly became unresponsive, and Mia, she took control." The words hung in the air, almost surreal. A 10-year-old had flown a plane that experienced sudden pilot incapacitation, something the aviation world had considered nearly impossible. Paramedics worked swiftly, administering emergency care. Captain Reynolds stirred first, eyes fluttering open with confusion. He looked around the cockpit, then at Mia, a mixture of astonishment, shame, and profound gratitude crossing his face. "How?" he whispered, voice hoarse. First Officer Patel blinked, slowly regaining awareness as if emerging from a fog. Mia's mother guided her daughter toward the paramedics and pilots. "This is your daughter," she said softly. She saved everyone." The words seemed inadequate to capture the enormity of the moment, yet they carried the weight of truth. Passengers, witnessing the reunion, erupted in tentative applause and murmurs of admiration. Tears, laughter, and disbelief coalesced into a raw, emotional symphony. Investigators arrived soon after, stepping into the cabin and asking questions, scanning instruments, and documenting the scene. Flight 782 had survived catastrophe, but the cause remained a mystery. Early readings suggested a sudden loss of consciousness in both pilots, potentially linked to a rare environmental or medical factor, but the precise mechanism was yet unknown. Airline officials and authorities exchanged tense glances, aware that such an event could shake public confidence in commercial aviation. Meanwhile, passengers were debriefed, escorted to waiting buses and emergency areas, some still trembling, some overwhelmed with awe at the heroism of a child who had defied every expectation. Every news crew on site clamored to interview her, though airline personnel shielded Mia and her mother from the swarm of cameras. It was too soon, too overwhelming, and yet impossible to ignore. Flight 782 had been saved by a 10-year-old. Mia's father arrived shortly thereafter, having been contacted during the flight by frantic authorities. When he saw his daughter, alive and unharmed, still trembling from the ordeal, he ran forward and enveloped her in a hug that seemed to last forever. "Mia, my brave little pilot," he whispered, tears streaming. She clung to him, exhausted but alive, her small frame shivering from adrenaline and relief. Investigators finally entered the cockpit, examining controls and instruments. The autopilot was engaged properly, one technician noted. No mechanical failures, no malfunctions other than minor engine fluctuations caused by turbulence. But the pilots themselves, he trailed off, shaking his head. Medical evaluation needed. It appears they were incapacitated simultaneously, for reasons we don't yet understand. Passengers began sharing their stories, voices shaky but heartfelt. "That little girl, she saved us all," one said, tears in his eyes. "I've flown hundreds of times, but I've never experienced anything like this." Others nodded, whispering gratitude and disbelief, some unable to articulate the enormity of what they had just witnessed. Mia, small and quiet, listened from a distance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. News helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting live footage of Flight 782 on the tarmac. Families, media outlets, and the world beyond watched in awe as authorities, airline officials, and paramedics navigated the aftermath. The story spread like wildfire. A 10-year-old child had saved a plane from certain disaster when both pilots were incapacitated. The narrative captivated hearts worldwide, inspiring awe, fear, and hope all at once. Airline officials approached Mia and her family, offering thanks, accolades, and reassurances. "Your bravery is unprecedented," one said. "You have saved lives and demonstrated extraordinary courage. The world will know your name." Mia, exhausted, simply nodded. She didn't fully grasp the magnitude of her actions yet, only that she had faced a terrifying moment and emerged alive with everyone else. Meanwhile, paramedics and medical teams monitored Captain Reynolds and First Officer Patel. Tests were being conducted to determine the cause of their simultaneous incapacitation, an event so rare it defied logic. Some suspected a sudden drop in cabin pressure or a mysterious environmental factor, while others feared a more ominous scenario. Whatever the explanation, the focus remained on the miracle that had occurred. Mia had stepped into the cockpit, guided by instinct, simulation knowledge, and sheer courage, and landed Flight 782 safely. Even as passengers disembarked, many turned back, craning their necks to look at the little girl whose courage had transcended age and expectation. Whispers of awe followed her down the aisle, murmurs of "she saved us" echoing in the cabin. Flight attendants offered smiles and small gestures of respect, still processing the extraordinary series of events. The world outside was beginning to grasp the significance. News feeds exploded with the story. Headlines heralded Mia as a hero, a child who had done the impossible. Social media buzzed with disbelief, admiration, and reverence. Yet amid the global attention, a sobering truth lingered. The pilot's silence had been real, inexplicable, and terrifying. Flight 782's crisis was over, but the mystery behind it demanded answers. Suspense hook, Flight 782 had landed safely. The passengers were alive. Mia had saved the day. Yet the pilot's incapacitation remained unexplained, a haunting mystery that loomed over the miracle, leaving everyone, passengers, authorities, and the world, questioning how and why this near catastrophe had occurred. The tarmac at Chicago was alive with activity. Emergency vehicles flashed their lights across the damp asphalt, media crews jostled for positions, and airline officials conferred urgently, though now with relief replacing the panic from just hours earlier. Flight 782 had safely landed, the passengers were unharmed, and the pilots were recovering under careful medical observation. But the real star of the day, the miracle worker, was a 10-year-old girl, Mia, whose courage had defied every expectation of what a child could do. Mia sat with her parents in a quiet corner of the airport's emergency lounge, wrapped in a soft blanket that did little to hide the tremor of adrenaline still coursing through her. Her father's hand rested on hers, fingers interlaced, while her mother stroked her hair gently. The world outside had begun to react. News crews were clamoring for statements, social media feeds exploded with praise, and airline officials were arranging interviews. But Mia remained quiet, absorbing the reality of what she had just accomplished. "You saved everyone, Mia," her mother whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "All of them, everyone on that plane, it's because of you." Mia's small shoulders shook, both from relief and exhaustion. I just did what I had to do," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but there was a quiet strength in her words. She had faced the unimaginable and acted decisively, but the weight of her heroism was still settling in. Outside the lounge, passengers were debriefed, escorted to waiting buses, and given the first chance to process the terror they had endured. Families hugged, children clung to parents, and the murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. "A child landed the plane," one whispered to another. "Can you imagine? A child." Many nodded, eyes wide, tears of relief glinting in the morning sunlight that had finally broken through the stormy clouds. Inside the cockpit, Captain David Reynolds and First Officer Sam Patel were awake and under close observation. Both men were pale, still shaken from their sudden incapacitation, but alive and stabilizing. Investigators, airline officials, and medical personnel crowded around them, asking questions, running tests, and carefully reviewing data from the plane's systems. Captain Reynolds looked at Mia as she entered the cockpit with her parents. His expression was a mix of awe, shame, and gratitude. I don't know how to thank you," he said hoarsely. You saved all of us. Every life on this plane. I don't know how you did it, but thank you." Mia looked at him quietly, her eyes still wide with lingering adrenaline. I just remembered what my dad taught me," she said simply. "I just remembered how to do it." The first officer, still trembling slightly, extended a hand to Mia. "I owe you my life," he whispered. "We both do." Her parents smiled, pride and relief etched across their faces, while Mia's father embraced her gently. News crews were eventually allowed to approach, capturing the story of the day that had defied logic and fear. Headlines erupted worldwide. 10-year-old saves Flight 782. Child hero lands plane. Flight 782 miracle. Girl defies death in the skis. Social media exploded with videos, photos, and retweets, making Mia an instant global symbol of courage, poise, and determination. But amid the celebration, investigators continued their work. The pilot's incapacitation remained mysterious. Blood tests, medical scans, and environmental checks on the aircraft were conducted with painstaking detail. Early theories suggested a rare form of hypoxia, a sudden lack of oxygen in the cockpit that affected both pilots simultaneously. Others considered cabin pressure anomalies or an unnoticed technical failure. Whatever the cause, the investigation remained ongoing, leaving a haunting question lingering over the miracle. Why had the crisis occurred in the first place? Meanwhile, airline officials prepared formal recognition for Mia. Certificates, medals, and official commendations were drafted, acknowledging her extraordinary bravery and life-saving actions. For the passengers, she had become a beacon of hope, a symbol that courage could appear in the most unexpected forms. One by one, passengers approached Mia, some with tears in their eyes, others clutching small tokens of gratitude. "Thank you," one elderly woman whispered, gripping Mia's hands. "You saved my grandchildren. You saved all of us." Children looked up at her with awe, some asking if she could teach them to fly. Adults smiled through tears, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The tiny girl who had faced death and chaos now inspired the world around her. Later, as the media coverage continued, Mia and her family returned home. News helicopters and reporters crowded the skis above the airport, documenting every angle of the story. Social media trended with hashtags: Flight 782 Hero, Mia Saves the Day, Child Pilot Miracle. Messages of support and admiration poured in from across the globe. Her life, once ordinary, had been irrevocably changed. Even at home, Mia's parents struggled to explain what had happened. "You were amazing," her father said, voice thick with emotion. "But it's okay to feel scared too. That was a lot." "I wasn't scared," Mia replied, though her voice wavered slightly. I had to do it." Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You had to do it," she said, "and you did." Weeks later, after the pilots had fully recovered and returned to their duties under strict observation, the investigation concluded with tentative findings. Both pilots had suffered acute hypoxia due to an unrecognized microleak in the cockpit's oxygen system, a phenomenon so rare that it had never been recorded in modern aviation history. Had it not been for Mia's quick thinking, hundreds of lives would have been lost. The aviation industry, stunned and grateful, praised the unprecedented bravery of a child who had defied every expectation. The story of Flight 782 became a case study in courage, instinct, and the unexpected heroes that can emerge when disaster strikes. Aviation schools incorporated simulations inspired by Mia's actions, emphasizing calm decision-making and quick thinking in emergencies. The world marveled at her poise, her focus, and the fact that a 10-year-old could accomplish something adults had deemed nearly impossible. And though accolades, medals, and headlines celebrated her, Mia remained quietly heroic. She didn't seek attention, nor did she fully grasp the global impact of her actions. In her mind, she had simply done what needed to be done to protect the people around her. Yet as she looked at the horizon one evening, watching planes ascend into the sky, she felt a quiet, unspoken connection to them. The memory of Flight 782 lingered in her mind, the roar of engines, the trembling of the fuselage, the terrified eyes of passengers, and the sudden weight of responsibility that had been thrust upon her small shoulders. It was a memory that would never fade, a defining moment that shaped the rest of her life. And somewhere deep inside, she knew one truth above all. Courage doesn't come from size, age, or experience. It comes from the willingness to act when everyone else is paralyzed by fear. She had proven it that day, soaring above the clouds, defying disaster and changing the world forever. Final emotional hook. Flight 782 had landed. The passengers were safe. The pilots recovered. The crisis had passed, but the legend of a 10-year-old girl who faced death and saved over 100 lives would endure forever, inspiring generations to come. And in the quiet moments, Mia understood something extraordinary. Heroism often arrives in the smallest, most unexpected forms.